The digital infrastructure industry is focused more than anything else on throughput. We want to get as many chips plugged in as possible, build the biggest models as possible. So we will invest whatever it takes to create a pipe that's big enough to meet that throughput demand. The energy industry does not operate under that same set of conditions. It operates on a more of a lean model. So here you have an industry that is 100% operating on this whole throughput mentality, trying to buy widgets from an industry that has no motivation to operate with the same mentality. And that's really where the real rub is in this intersect between the digital and energy worlds today.
Hello and welcome to Cool Vector. I'm your host, David Snow, and today we're joined by Brian Janis. He's the co-founder and chief commercial officer of Cloverleaf. Cloverleaf provides sustainable energy solutions to data centers, semiconductor factories, and green fuels projects. In other words, Cloverleaf provides energy to massive consumers of energy. So, Brian, thanks for being on Cool Vector Day. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, David. Really excited to be on the podcast.
It is important to note that you were the vice president in charge of energy for Microsoft's global data center activities. Let's talk a little bit about what the scope of that is before we get to what the mission of Cloverleaf is. At Microsoft, you led a team of over 100 to develop data center sites in more than 40 countries. You've executed some 15 gigawatts of renewable energy power purchase agreements. I'm guessing that 15 gigawatts is at least enough energy to power a single ChatGPT inquiry. According to my own AI-assisted research, Microsoft operates more than 200 data centers in 34 countries, connected by 165,000 miles of optical cable. And in 2023, Microsoft used as much energy, 24 terawatt hours, as the country of Azerbaijan, which has a population of 10 million people. So, Brian, maybe first you could help paint a picture of the scope and the scale of what you oversaw at Microsoft.
Yeah, happy to. I mean, you did a great job, David. That was a good summary of sort of where we ended up over my tenure at Microsoft, which was almost 12 years. But it's interesting to think about where we started. So when I joined Microsoft, energy was not a major concern for the company. It wasn't even clear to me when they started recruiting me for the role why the role was even necessary. I'd never thought of a tech company as needing to think about energy as a strategic function. But of course, as you're well aware, tech companies are now some of the biggest infrastructure companies in the world, surpassing big oil. And of course, all of that is built on the back of the need for energy. And I was talking to the head of corporate strategy towards the end of my tenure, and he said to me, I don't think people fully realize how much Microsoft is just a silicon and power company. We need access to silicon chips and we need power. That's the whole business. And that's just the reality of this industry today. It's become so incredibly dependent on the power sector for its overall growth and success.
While you were at Microsoft, how did its thinking about its energy usage evolve?
Yeah, it was definitely an evolution. And what I saw is year over year, increasing awareness of the importance of energy to the company. And along with that came an increasing awareness of the impact of that energy consumption and the carbon footprint associated with it. I remember talking to my team very early on, and one of the things I was fond of saying is that energy is never going to be office for Microsoft. Like let's not get ahead of ourselves in terms of how important this is ever going to be to Steve Ballmer or Satya or whomever. The reality is, towards the end of my tenure, it was one of the top order things that our executives were thinking about. And so it definitely evolved from the advent of the cloud, and cloud being, when I joined in 2011, a very small part of Microsoft's overall business, to cloud and AI being the dominant force in the business today. And all of that business, again, is predicated on acquiring electricity. I mean, the whole business is taking electrons and turning it into data.
At Microsoft, you were in charge of power supply planning for de novo data centers. What percentage of the overall challenge was simply the fact that the demand for energy was outstripping the supply? Initially,
that was not the problem. I mean, when you think about what data centers were 10 years ago, we would build a 10 megawatt data center or a 20 megawatt data center and wonder if we were ever even going to fill the whole thing up with servers. We weren't really driving the utilities to have to make significant investment. The world changed towards the end of last decade when we started tipping into the hundreds of megawatt scale I was becoming increasingly concerned about the continued growth rate that we were seeing, and the fact that each year those tranche sizes of the amount of power we were going to need was going to start to become pretty substantial for these utilities. And then, of course, when AI struck, then everyone woke up to this challenge of these data centers are going to take a lot more power than utilities are prepared to give them. And particularly given the context of the utility industry, the growth rate had been relatively flat for nearly 15 to 20 years. So here you have an industry that has a voracious appetite for a product, trying to get that product from an industry that does not have muscle memory for what growth looks like. And that was sort of the sort of perfect storm that we've found ourselves in today.
It sounds like your job actually got more and more important as the years went by. It started out as maybe something at a cocktail party. Someone would say like, sorry, what do you do? But now it's sort of like you're the guy. The supply of energy to data centers and to digital infrastructure is the key to the growth of that industry. Did you find that as your sort of tenure went from year to year?
Oh, absolutely. And not just at cocktail parties, but even inside the halls of Microsoft, I would often get, wait a minute, we have an energy what? Why does this job exist? Towards the end, it was incredibly clear, why this was important, and the awareness of the existential nature of energy to the company was pretty well understood. In fact, I remember shortly after ChatGPT-3 was released, and of course that's OpenAI's product that's built on Microsoft infrastructure, we were having a debate internally about, was the problem we were going to have that we were not going to be able to have enough chips, or that we wouldn't have enough power. And it was very clear to me that power was going to be the problem. The chip manufacturing responds just like any other sort of capitalist enterprise does, and it sees demand, and so it invests more capital and builds more plants and builds more production capacity. That's not the way the electric utility industry works. And so it was always going to be a power problem. Keep in mind, this is also in the context of increasing demand for electricity from things like electric vehicles, home heating, plus, particularly in the United States, a significant growth in the onshoring of manufacturing.
Tell us a little bit about Cloverleaf. What is its mission? A very important part of Cloverleaf is that it's sustainable energy. So how did you come up with the business plan, and what are you trying to do?
Yes, as we looked around the industry, we saw that the challenge we were going to face is where's all the power going to come from? And as we looked at sort of the traditional developers in the space, we didn't see a lot of deep power expertise that was taking this very power-centric approach to solving this problem, because it is ultimately a power problem. Now, we have capitalized ourselves to be able to acquire land, invest in energy infrastructure, but we really are a power business. In some ways, real estate is our necessary evil. We have to have land in order to have a canvas on which to do our work. It's because we do see this as an amazing opportunity for utilities and communities, for job creation, for economic development and growth. And so we're really excited about, sitting down with utilities, helping them navigate these challenges, and hopefully creating an environment where they're going to see load growth and all the associated benefits that come along with that.
Well, since you have gone through the whole cycle of looking for a site for a data center, selecting that site, doing the due diligence, just talk about what are the first things you look at when evaluating a possible site for a data center?
Well, today, there's no question it's power. Like what is the infrastructure that's available to interconnect to the system, and then what is the capacity that's available inside of that system? So it's not just about finding transmission lines. I mean, just like a highway, you can have a highway next to your house, but if it's always congested, it's going to take you forever to get anywhere. The power system's no different. You have to understand the congestion that exists on the system, how the load is flowing, and where are the optimal points that you could interconnect today, and then what are the incremental investments that need to be taken in order to get what we look at in terms of the priorities, which are speed, scale, and sustainability. That's really what this industry is looking for. They want to plug in as many GPUs as possible, as quickly as possible. They want to do it at a scale that is unprecedented, and they still have very ambitious climate targets. When you think about ultimately the customers that we're talking about, there's really just a handful of them. And they collectively have some of the most ambitious sustainability commitments in the world.
Well, talk about just the nitty-gritty on the ground due diligence that you perform when you're looking at a site. Is it looking for proximity to a potential source of renewable energy? Is it something else?
I mean, definitely proximity to existing infrastructure, because given the speed priority, we want to minimize the amount of new infrastructure that needs to be built, at least right out of the gate. Right. So we want to have access to in essence, a big pipe, high voltage transmission line. And then the next thing really have to think about is the supply chain components around getting new substation infrastructure built. This is a very supply chain constrained world that we're living in the energy infrastructure space, because the types of equipment we're talking about, high voltage step down equipment, this stuff is not on the shelf. Almost all of these components are manufactured on order. And as more and more utilities are ordering more and more of this equipment, it's creating further backlog.
If you could sort of characterize a dream scenario, let's say one of your associates comes to you and says, hey, Brian, I found a place that's got attributes X, Y, and Z. What would be the pitch that would make you say, oh, hot damn, let's go look at this place?
I mean, again, the biggest one is I got a utility that really wants to work with us. Because a lot of utilities are sort of overburdened by this and are not particularly excited about another customer showing up at the door. But when you get to those utilities that are seeing this as really the opportunity of probably of this century for that industry, because if you think about this growth trajectory, these servers are going somewhere. They're going to land in some utility's backyard. And the utilities that are nimble and that are responsive to the opportunity and see the economic development, job creation, tax rate, like all the things that come with this, and really lean in to take advantage of this opportunity, they're going to win most of the spoils. And their communities are going to benefit in terms of jobs and growth and all the things that come along with that. And so that's the thing that I get most excited about is, frankly, when a utility calls me and says, hey, we've got an opportunity we want you to come take a look at. What do you think about this? In fact, that happened to me just 2 weeks ago. I had a utility call and say, hey, I had this thing fall through and I want to talk to you about this. I think this could be a great data center site. That's the perfect scenario for us, is when you have a utility that's really looking to lean in.
Can you just give us sort of the hierarchy of things that you look at before you say, yes, this site is suitable for a large data center? Maybe proximity to energy is at the top. Where does community engagement come in? Just kind of talk about the other factors.
These are massive infrastructure projects. And so you have to think about all the different aspects associated with building and constructing large infrastructure. So for instance, the labor force, people don't tend to think about data centers as bringing a lot of jobs, but first of all, they bring a tremendous amount of construction jobs to a project when you're talking about a multi-hundred megawatt or even gigawatt scale project. I mean, this is a multi-billion-dollar project. And so, you can't just go into the middle of nowhere and build something like this. You have to have access to a strong labor force. And at the same time, you also have to think about what are the community implications for being in this region. A lot of traffic associated with construction. So how is that going to impact the local community? A lot of data centers may use water as well. So, is that feasible in that particular region? Being a good neighbor is incredibly important for this business, because the fact of the matter is no one particularly wants a data center in their backyard. NIMBYism is real. And so we have to be thoughtful when we're going into a community. Are they going to recognize the benefits that come along with having data centers in their community, which are the jobs it creates? The tax revenue is significant. So there are a lot of benefits and a lot of reasons why you would want a data center in your community.
What do you recommend, or what are some best practices for engaging with the community, for framing the opportunity to build a data center? And what are some common missteps?
Mostly it's listening. Right. Understanding, what are the priorities of the community? Microsoft did an excellent job with this. They had a strong community engagement team and program, built around that. As we've certainly seen time and again, where, communities and even entire countries have sort of pushed back and created moratoriums around data center growth. We've seen it in Singapore, we've seen it in the Netherlands, we've seen it in places like Dublin, anywhere where you have a substantial concentration of data centers. There's always a risk there's going to be pushback. And so the industry has to be really careful as we're looking over the next 5 to 10 years, and the fact that these data centers are going to get much larger, they're going to consume much more energy. There is a tendency, that we've seen with utilities, that the first thing to go is a data center. When they start feeling constrained and start feeling pressure, and they are making a choice between, am I going to have power to give to Hyundai or the next auto manufacturer that comes in and brings thousands of jobs versus a data center, they're going to bias towards the factory. And so this industry has to be really focused on, how do we make sure that we're investing in infrastructure the right way, that people are realizing the benefits that data centers can bring to a community, and working closely with utilities and other stakeholders to ensure that there's an environment that is conducive to that sort of growth that we need to achieve as an industry.
When you are performing due diligence on a site, what are some common reasons why you have to abandon the project or abandon the site? You get halfway down the road, maybe you get very far down the road, and then you learn something and you got to scrap the whole thing.
The biggest one today is the power timeline slipping. Right? You had a certain assumption about when that power is going to be available. That has become increasingly harder because utilities are getting significantly more inquiries and requests and queue positions for these very large projects. And so they're having a difficult time sometimes even estimating how long it's going to take, as well as the sort of building supply chain issues. 10 utilities put in the same request at the same time for the same sort of infrastructure. That's obviously going to create a backlog. And so assumptions about how long it's going to take to get projects done, or how long it's going to take to get access to the labor. We're all competing for the same electricians and the same labor pool. That's the biggest thing and the biggest risk to the industry is that you kind of have a power timeline set, and then it starts to slip out.
I know that in the real estate world, the institutional real estate world, people talk a lot about the risk associated with de novo project, with greenfield projects, because there is the possibility that you might have to abandon the whole thing for some unforeseen factor. What would you say to institutional investors who are trying to get their arms around the risk associated with deploying capital in the time frame that they hope to deploy capital into digital infrastructure projects? How would you frame the risk conversation?
It's interesting because that's a conversation I've been having a lot with the digital infrastructure investors, both in the PE world as well as the companies that actually build this stuff. There's clearly a lot of capital being thrown at this challenge in terms of the opportunity space to build out digital infrastructure. But there's also a lot of concern that capital is going to be slow to be deployed precisely because the inability to get hands on enough electrons. We need utilities to step up and accelerate the build out of infrastructure. It's really been in the last 12 to 18 months that realization has sunk in. And now everyone's sort of scrambling for a dance partner to figure out, okay, how do we take all this capital we want to deploy and make sure that we have the right sort of signal going into the electric utility industry to ensure that there's appropriate action there to provide the electrons that are needed.
They didn't realize that the dance was going to be as long and slow as it was. Let's talk about the fact that you are devoted to sustainable energy. How much more complexity does the requirement for sustainability, for low carbon, bring to these site selection projects?
We are certainly in a world where speed and scale, as I said, are critically important to these companies. And sometimes that does mean leaning on existing infrastructure, potentially extending the life of fossil-based assets. And we've seen these debates going on in regulatory proceedings where utilities are saying, I can meet that demand, but here's the way that I'm going to have to do it, right? And so that is sort of flying in the face of these sustainability commitments. And you've already seen Microsoft and Google and others acknowledge that they're not really on track for the commitments that were set, say, in the late teens. There's a whole lot of things that we didn't know. This was pre-COVID, this was pre the supply chain headwinds that we've seen, and pre-AI. So the overall growth trajectory is much higher than anyone anticipated. So it does make how we're going to get to that zero carbon reality much more difficult. We still need to be thinking about what are strategic investments we can make in zero carbon resources, be it wind, solar, storage today, increasingly advanced geothermal, and at some point it will be things like SMRs and new nuclear. That's going to take time. I think it's going to take longer than what a lot of folks in the tech industry think it's going to take, but it will be part of the solution long term.
How much easier would it be to simply use the traditional sources of energy?
Oh, it'd be a lot easier. Yeah, because we're talking about sort of using existing infrastructure versus having to build a lot of new infrastructure. And we have the same issues on the renewable side in terms of supply chain interconnection issues, grid operators being slow to approve those connections. And so what we're trying to do is create that runway and that line of sight to where that zero carbon energy is going to come from, because it's almost entirely unrealistic to believe that we're going to meet the needs of the AI industry and the growth trajectory and do it with 100% zero carbon energy day one. It is going to be a transition.
How would you characterize a general level of enthusiasm across utilities for this next level of energy provision for data centers? Is it 50% or gung-ho and the other 50% are sort of apprehensive, or how would you characterize it?
That's probably a good mix. I think there's a lot of apprehension. There's a lot of exhaustion. I was talking to a utility a few weeks ago, and they said, we used to get 1 to 2 sort of like large customer requests a year, say 20 megawatts or above, and now we're getting that like once or twice a week. Just imagine, being in a scenario like that where you could manage those requests with almost no process. In fact, most utilities don't really have a process for managing the interconnection of large loads because, again, if you do something once a year, you don't particularly need much of a process. But now you have a connection queue that's a mile long, and you really got to think about, how am I prioritizing each of these customers? How do I think about their viability of their project? Because not all these projects are going to come to fruition either. So they're looking at it going, well, how do I know who I'm even supposed to be spending time with, who I'm supposed to be prioritizing? So I think most utilities are facing that challenge, but it's the ones that really lean in and get the most creative are going to be able to move more customers through those queues and then reap the benefits associated with it.
Are there any particular bureaucratic procedures or something that have been delaying these projects that you could tell us about?
Yeah, a lot of the delay is actually regulatory in nature. I mean, the supply chain issues are real, but one of the concerns that we have in this industry, again, is that lack of muscle memory, right? Again, almost 20 years of no load growth. And so now utilities are going to their boards, they're going to their regulators and saying, hey, I know last year we said we were going to have 0.5% load growth for the next 5 years. Well, now it's 2.5% a year or 3% a year. And so we're going to have to, in some cases, utilities are forecasting doubling the size of their system over the next 10 years or so, which is just unprecedented for this industry. And so convincing their shareholders, their leaders, their regulators that this is in fact real and it warrants the type of investment, billions of dollars that we're going to have to put into our system to meet this load, it's often met with skepticism. And again, going back to sort of the misperceptions about this industry, that, well, what if this is all going to go away? Is this just Bitcoin? Is that what AI is? Is it real? Are these companies really serious about this growth? That's probably the biggest challenge, because that creates sort of a regulatory lag and slows down approval for investment. It puts barriers up to utilities and able to accelerate investment. And so that's the piece I'm actually most concerned about, are the regulators who really control this industry. Because again, it doesn't act like a typical business. Well, let me put it this way. The digital infrastructure industry is focused more than anything else on throughput. We want to get as many chips plugged in as possible, build the biggest models as possible. So we will invest whatever it takes to create a pipe that's big enough to meet that throughput demand. The energy industry does not operate under that same set of conditions. It operates on a more of a lean model. If you think about sort of the two different models for manufacturing, one is sort of the theory of constraints, which is, hey, it's okay to have a ton of excess inventory of widget X because that's where we're going to get constrained at some point. So we want to make sure we have as much of those widgets as possible. Whereas the lean model says, well, no, we'll just order those whenever we need them, but it's going to slow the whole process down. So we're okay. We want to minimize inventory, not necessarily increase throughput. So here you have an industry that is 100% operating on this whole throughput mentality, trying to buy widgets from an industry that has no motivation to operate with the same mentality. And that's really where the real rub is in this intersect between the digital and energy worlds today.
Is there a clear winner or a form of renewable energy that is clearly going to be the dominant form, at least in the near term, to supply electricity to data centers?
Solar is going to dominate. We've seen massive declines in the cost of solar energy. I saw someone post something the other day that it was an ad from Home Depot, and it showed a solar panel that was about the same size as a section of fence, and the solar panel was cheaper than the wooden fence, right? So you're talking about a commodity product that is just ridiculously inexpensive, relative to what we've seen in the past. So the combination of significant amounts of solar with ever increasingly lower cost storage is going to be a huge contribution.
Which of the other forms of renewable energy, including these ones that are sort of just burgeoning, I guess you could say, like geothermal, new nuclear, which one do you think is going to make the biggest impact over the long term?
Well, this decade, I think we're going to see significant growth in advanced geothermal. We're seeing a lot of promise in that space, like what we've seen with fracking, because frankly, it's using a lot of the same technology. Fracking was transformational in terms of our ability to extract oil and gas. Likewise, I think we're going to continue to see a lot of growth in the advanced geothermal space. I think long duration energy storage is going to have a significant impact. These are things like multi-day energy storage, new transmission. So the build out of high voltage, DC transmission is going to be important. And then longer term, I do think advanced nuclear, both advanced fission and fusion, will start to play a role, but that's going to be into the 2030s. That's not going to be this decade. So if we build out a lot more transition, which means we can move, say, more electrons from the desert Southwest into the central part of the country, you actually need less baseload energy because you'll have wind at one part of the day, you'll have solar at another part of the day. And so there's trade-offs. So all of these things are kind of up in the air right now, which makes it an exciting time for the industry because there's a lot of technology that's going to help to have a significant contribution, but it's not at all clear exactly how all this is going to play out yet.
What do investors need to understand about the power purchase agreements that are structured between the data centers and the providers of renewable energy?
Those contracts are like gold. I mean, you think about the credit rating of the companies that we're talking about here. When I was at Microsoft, we had a better credit rating than the US government. So those contracts are extraordinarily valuable. And again, it goes back to why I'm optimistic, because when you have companies making multi-billion-dollar investments in infrastructure, first of all, those are very, very long-lived assets. One of the misnomers I think that people have about the data center industry is they view the cloud as being this sort of ethereal thing that it can just pick up and move. And, I can take my workloads in Ireland and I can move them to Singapore. And, that's not the way that works. Companies build their entire systems to a particular place on the grid. It's actually tied to a particular location. So you can't just shut that data center down and move all that workload. Data centers stick around for a long time, but factories get shut down all the time. If the labor prices in that region, rise or supply chain issues or tax issues, those sort of businesses are oftentimes relatively low margins. And, some of those local issues have a significant impact. And so you'll see a factory shut down. You'll see that, offshored or moved into a different factory. You don't see that with data centers very often. Once you build a data center, it pretty much stays there and continues to grow. And so if you look at some of the legacy regions of the big cloud providers like AWS, US East region, or Microsoft out in Quincy, Washington, those started with one building. And now if you go to those sites today, there are dozens of buildings. Those workloads are very durable, which then means that the financial commitment from those companies is extraordinarily valuable because it's not going anywhere.
The data center industry and digital infrastructure in general is viewed by the world of institutional investors as, infrastructure. And infrastructure is characterized by long-term contracts, the ability to predict revenue. Sounds like everything fits the bill for infrastructure. If you were to invest in the energy project, that too would be infrastructure because of these long-term contracts with the data centers. Is that the case? Is there any monkey wrench that could be thrown into that ecosystem that would make people think that maybe this revenue isn't as predictable as we thought?
Typically, when you're talking about energy infrastructure, also very long-lived sort of assets. And so they require, multi-year, if not decade plus commitments. And we see in this industry is more than willing to sign contracts for 10, 15, 20, sometimes 25 years to back these assets because they believe that these assets are going to be around for that entire life. That's sort of proven out. And I remember doing the very first power purchase agreement that we did at Microsoft in 2013 and, sitting down with our CFO at the time and sort of making that argument that, listen, we're building data centers. These things are going to be around for 20 years. We're going to be buying electrons the entirety of that 20-year plus life. We might as well sort of align our energy commitments and our energy investments to that same time horizon. By the time I left, we'd done over 15 gigawatts of those. Our first one was 110 megawatts, which seemed huge at the time, but in retrospect, it's pretty insignificant in today's world.
As you know, there's been a tremendous amount of interest in the data center space and digital infrastructure. Private equity firms are getting into it. There are many new entrants into the asset class, and it didn't even used to be thought of as an asset class. What do some of these new entrants discover once they get into it? Like, without naming names, have you had any interesting conversations with people who are like, hey, we thought we were going to put $5 billion to work, but then turned out we didn't think about these few things?
The thing that everyone has come to realize in the last 12 to 18 months is that this is an energy business. The digital infrastructure is part of the energy supply chain. It is wholly dependent upon the build out of energy infrastructure. That wasn't really true when this industry started. In fact, if you look at the makeup of most of the big digital infrastructure companies, the big co-location companies, for instance, most of the expertise that built those businesses was either in fiber or real estate. There's very little deep power industry expertise, but almost overnight, they've all come to realize, as have all their private equity parents, that this is a power business and it requires deep understanding of how utilities operate, of how regulators think about the world, of energy technology and its role. The world's changed, and you're definitely seeing that recognition from a lot of the leaders of these companies. So it's been certainly a good time to be starting a company that is focused on solving this problem. Maybe we were smart, but sometimes we felt a little bit lucky that we sort of jumped into this when we did, because it really, even in the last 6 months, when it's on, the cover of the New York Times, it's in the Washington Post, all of these big papers, you're starting to realize this is a pretty mainstream challenge that we're facing.
Not to get too far into the realm of politics, but if there were a dream regulatory framework or some tax incentive that could be thrown into the mix that would be to the benefit of all parties in making this industry grow in the right, most responsible way, any recommendations?
The most important thing is permitting. Permitting, especially for transmission lines. That's probably been the hardest thing to get done in this country. We haven't had a major build out of transmission infrastructure for many years. That's the hardest thing to do. And that's what slows down then the interconnection of generation and load, because that is what's creating the backlog. And we have seen some movement in DC to create sort of regional transmission corridors that enable faster permitting. The permitting reform discussions that are going on right now in Washington are critically important. And so hopefully we'll see more movement on that to make it easier to build things in this country. But I mean, really since the 1970s, it's just become a lot harder to build big things in this country. And then when you don't do something for a long time, then you forget how to do it. And so we just don't have the muscle memory to build really big things anymore. We saw that recently with, our most recent build out of nuclear power plant in Georgia. That project was way over budget and it was way behind schedule. And not because I think anyone did anything wrong. It's just we forgot how to do that. The people that built our current nuclear fleet, none of those people are working anymore. They all retired years ago. So you don't have even the right sort of skill set, and we can rebuild it. I mean, we can do that as a country. It's just going to take us time to do it.
Do you see evidence that this huge amount of capital and effort and energy going into the creation of sustainable energy for these massive customers, data centers, digital infrastructure, that is driving innovation in the field of sustainable energy?
Oh, it absolutely is. Yeah. And that's what's exciting, and where I get optimistic is that you're talking about some of the most innovative companies in the world. And you've seen a lot of the discussion around things like fusion. I mean, Microsoft did the first fusion PVA with a company that's largely owned by Sam Altman, Helion. And you're seeing a lot of investment in things like, long duration storage. Google's done a lot in advanced geothermal. So there's a lot of excitement around what we can do with technology and recognition that this is an opportunity. If you're not constrained, there's not a whole lot of incentive to innovate. Why do anything if the system's working? But everyone realizes that the current approach isn't going to work and that it is going to necessitate new forms of transmission. I'm on the board of a superconducting transmission company. And that's going to be critically important to cities getting more dense. And we're trying to move more electrons into more places. And so we have to find ways to get more out of the existing system and existing rights of ways. So there's a lot of excitement in this space right now around how we're going to use new technology.
So Brian, maybe final question for you. Can you think of an anecdote or an incident or even something personally that kind of crossed your path that really indicates that the public is very aware of the energy needs for this huge data center build out and the importance of this to society.
I believe it was Trump said at some point that we're going to have so much energy that we're going to have to tell him, no, Mr. President, please stop. We have too much electricity. And the next day, my son came up to me and he said, hey, Dad, if that happens, then nobody probably needs you anymore, do they? I was like, well, that's a good point. I think there's clearly an awareness and a concern, and the concern is real. Ultimately, I look at all of this as a huge opportunity. Like needing more electricity, growing the electric grid, this is all goodness. This all means that we're making investments and we're building things in this country. We're bringing factories back to this country. We're building some of the most sophisticated AI models in the world in this country. All of these things are a net good for society. And I think will also be an accelerant to decarbonization. Again, it's going to be bumpy to get there, but ultimately we'll look back on this as a real benefit to our overall decarbonization efforts as a society.
Well, Brian Janis, I'm going to let you get back to innovating in the sphere of sustainable energy, but thank you so much for joining Cool Vector today, and I hope we can have you back some point in the future.
Thanks a lot, David. Really appreciate it.